expert mechanism are working on a important theme, the protection of the languages and identities of indigenous people. What do you think about the work of this session?
The report that was prepared for this session on indigenous languages and cultures, I think, is a very, very useful report. It complements a report that was produced by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues several years ago on indigenous languages. Indigenous languages are endangered in many parts of the world, as the Secretary General of the United Nations said last year at the opening of the Permanent Forum. One indigenous language dies every 2 weeks. And that's very significant. And many languages are now endangered. And in 1, 2, 3 generations, many languages will be completely extinct. So it's really important that this report now continues to keep the focus on this dire situation.
Indigenous people have their ancient traditions. How do you think they can protect them, their traditions, in this kind of world dominated by majority societies?
Well, in the country where I come from, Canada, in North America, for sure, that there is it's very dominated by the English language, by a culture that's very attractive to young people. It's really difficult to talk about the ancient traditions and stories of our peoples when the young people are, they're attuned to the modern technologies, to the modern world. But what's happening, what I see very interesting is that the young people are now using the technology to know more about who they are, about their languages and about their cultures. You see languages are as apps for phones and for documents that are important, and the youth are picking it up. So I think there are opportunities that we can take advantage of. I think it's not entirely a lost cause. I think there's a very deep sense of pride among the young people, and they're turning to our traditions more and more and more now as a way to help them navigate this very complex modern world.
At the Permanent Forum in New York, you were the chairperson. This year, the special theme was Discovery Doctrine. What do you think? What were the conclusions of the works?
The major conclusion was to call on states and the UN to repudiate the doctrine of discovery in all its forms and what it means, based on a notion of superiority of civilizations, that indigenous peoples at the time of contact were deemed to be not civilized, were deemed to be, because they weren't Christian, were not deemed to be able to be capable of owning lands. And as a result of that doctrine, is as between the countries in Europe at the time, based on the papal bulls of the Pope in Rome, that this gave the moral authority for states as between themselves to claim lands where they discovered it. So they would plant the flags of England or Spain or Holland or other European countries in the New World and claim sovereignty over these lands. And these ramifications are still very real today and still very much evident in all parts of what I see. In Americas that I'm aware of, for sure. In other parts of the world as well, we have appointed one of our members of the Permanent Forum to do a study on the application of the doctrine of discovery in Africa, for example. And so we continue to do that work. Just a week and a half ago, in a very important land case in my part of Canada, in the western part of Canada, involving the Chilcotin tribe, the Chilcotin Nation, the Court of Appeal referred to this, what they call the principle of discovery, gave the right to sovereignty to England, to the Queen or to the King. and as a result of that had the authority to make laws and own the lands that indigenous peoples had heretofore owned. And based on that principle, rejected the claim by the indigenous peoples to indigenous title to their territory. What the court said was maybe they might be able to claim some place where they were as a salt lick, or maybe the rock they stood on, the fish, or maybe a little small ravine where they walked in between places, but they can't claim title to their territory. It was a very high-level court decision. It will be appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, but you see, this doctrine is very much alive and real today, and the courts are applying it.
The effects of Discovery Doctrine are still alive, unfortunately.
They're still alive each and every day. You know, the Indian residential schools was a manifestation of the doctrine of discovery because it was built on the notion that indigenous civilizations were inferior and that somehow indigenous peoples needed to be Christianized and to be civilized. And these Indian residential schools in Canada and the US in particular were the instruments of this state policy.
Also in Europe, there are many problems about that because perhaps Vatican have to close Discovery Doctrine, but this bull is still alive also in Vatican, no?
Well, it's very much, they've said they repudiated the doctrine. We need to see the evidence of the church. We've seen the World Council of Churches have taken steps to repudiate the doctrine. Except for the Catholic Church, they haven't taken what I haven't seen concrete steps on their part, because in the Middle Ages, as we refer to, it was the church that provided that moral guidance and that moral authority, played a very political role in the so-called discovery of the New Worlds in particular, and the continent of Africa as well.
What is your personal hope and project for your community, for the future of your community?
Well, we're very much engaged in extensive discussions in our communities with the government around the redress involving lands. In the mid-1800s, the governors, the colonial governors of the day, passed proclamations stating that all lands in that part of the country belong to the crown in fee simple, in fee. And as a result of that one document, based on the doctrine of discovery, we find that Indian people, First Nations people, or indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their lands by a simple proclamation.
And what about your sacred land? What are you doing for protect them?
We have developments that are impacting on many sacred sites. We have residential business development happening on top of these sacred sites. In the case of the village in Vancouver, in an area called Marpole, they've discovered extensive evidence of human habitation, an old village site, a very large site, with thousands and thousands of artifacts, including human remains in burial sites. And this company wants to build a condominium on top of that. And so the community said, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to desecrate these sacred burial sites. So it's led to an occupation of that site by the members of the community, and it's been going on for a couple of months right now. And the government and the company and the city and the indigenous communities are trying to find, through some negotiations, a resolution to that problem. And the community, the indigenous community, in fact, has offered to take some of their land somewhere else and offer that in exchange for returning this site, so that they could keep it for the future as a sacred site, which I think is a very important initiative on their part.
In conclusion, are you satisfied about the work that in all this year you have done and the United Nations have done for indigenous people?
It's always a work in progress. You know, we have the most important development that's taken place is, of course, the adoption of the Declaration by the United Nations General Assembly after some 25 years of negotiations in Geneva here, We had the declaration adopted 5 years ago in September. And now the major issue is to implement that declaration. And even though there are countries who have endorsed the declaration, there's still a tremendous gap between the endorsement of the declaration and the practical application of that. There are some countries who say, well, we've endorsed it, but we will not do anything else.
Okay, thank you very much.
You are welcome.